The discovery began in one of the last places anyone expected history to change. Hidden among the dry caves of south-central Oregon, archaeologists uncovered something so ordinary in appearance that it could easily have been overlooked, yet so extraordinary in meaning that it would force scientists to question decades of accepted belief. The material was carefully collected and sent to the laboratory for dating. The first result seemed impossible. Certain that a mistake had been made, researchers repeated the analysis using a different sample and an entirely different machine. The numbers returned again. A third round of testing produced the same astonishing conclusion. Every scientific method pointed toward a single reality that contradicted one of the most deeply rooted stories in American archaeology. Whoever had left this evidence behind had stood on the North American continent thousands of years earlier than conventional history claimed was possible. It was not simply a discovery that adjusted an existing timeline. It threatened to dismantle the foundation upon which generations of textbooks had been written. The quiet caves of Oregon had suddenly become the center of one of the greatest archaeological debates of the modern era. Before moving forward, please subscribe to this channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. For much of the 20th century, the story of the first Americans appeared settled beyond dispute. Students learned that the earliest inhabitants of the continent were the Clovis people, named after the archaeological site near Clovis, New Mexico, where their distinctive fluted stone spear points were first identified. These highly skilled hunters were believed to have crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago during the last ice age, before moving south through an ice-free corridor that eventually opened between massive glaciers. Their expertly crafted spear points, carved with a central flute that reduced weight while increasing effectiveness, became the unmistakable signature of the first human culture in North America. The theory was elegant, logical, and widely accepted. It appeared in classrooms, documentaries, museums, and academic publications. For decades, it was defended with remarkable confidence by archaeologists whose professional reputations had become intertwined with the Clovis first model. According to this narrative, there was little room for earlier human occupation, and evidence that challenged it was often viewed with deep skepticism. Yet while this debate centered on stone tools and migration routes, another surprising detail lingered in the background. There was no securely dated evidence of tobacco use anywhere in prehistoric America before roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, reinforcing the belief that much of the continent's cultural history unfolded far later than many imagined. Everything began to change when archaeologists returned their attention to a collection of dry limestone shelters known as the Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon. Researchers had been aware of these caves for decades, but previous investigations had never penetrated deeply enough into the oldest deposits. As excavations progressed through the undisturbed layers of sediment, the discoveries became increasingly unexpected. Instead of uncovering weapons or beautifully crafted stone tools, the team encountered preserved human coprolites, ancient human waste that had dried and hardened on the cave floor thousands of years earlier. While such material might seem unremarkable, the exceptionally dry desert environment had accomplished something no museum could ever replicate. It had protected delicate organic remains across an immense span of time, preserving biological information that stone artifacts alone could never reveal. Hidden within these ancient deposits was intact mitochondrial DNA, a genetic record left behind by the people themselves. When scientists extracted and sequenced the DNA, the results were extraordinary. The genetic signatures belonged to Native American founding haplogroups, A2 and B2, directly connecting these ancient individuals to the ancestors of modern indigenous peoples of the Americas. These were not representatives of some mysterious extinct population or an unsuccessful migration that disappeared without descendants. They were members of the same ancestral lineages whose descendants continue to live across the Americas today, linking present-day communities with people who had occupied this Oregon cave thousands upon thousands of years earlier. The genetic evidence alone would have made Paisley Caves an extraordinary sight, but the dating results transformed it into one of the most controversial archaeological discoveries in North America. Scientists relied on accelerator mass spectrometry, an advanced dating technique capable of measuring the age of organic material directly, rather than depending on surrounding sediments or associated artifacts. Once the results were carefully calibrated, the preserved coprolites consistently dated to more than 14,000 years before the present, at least 1,000 years older than the accepted arrival of the Clovis people. The implications were impossible to ignore. If the dates were correct, then Clovis hunters could no longer be considered the first inhabitants of the continent. Instead, they represented a later culture that had arrived after other human populations were already established. Yet even this remarkable revelation was not the first challenge to the Clovis first model. Paisley Caves simply provided the evidence that finally forced the broader archaeological community to confront questions that had been quietly accumulating for decades. Those questions had first emerged thousands of miles away in western Pennsylvania at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, a sandstone overhang overlooking a small stream roughly 7 miles upstream from the Ohio River. Protected by sweeping rock ledges that formed a natural roof, the shelter would have offered prehistoric travelers an ideal resting place, leading one archaeologist to describe it as possessing all the attractions of a prehistoric holiday destination. The story began in 1955 when local historian Albert Miller investigated a groundhog burrow and unexpectedly recovered artifacts that suggested extraordinary antiquity. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1973, archaeologist Dr. Jim Adovazio initiated systematic excavations, removing soil layer by layer with meticulous precision. As the excavation descended deeper into the shelter, the evidence grew steadily older. Radiocarbon analyses eventually indicated that humans had occupied Meadowcroft between approximately 16,000 and 19,000 calibrated calendar years ago. When Adovazio published these findings in the journal American Antiquity in July 1980, he directly challenged the Clovis first model that dominated archaeological thought. The reaction was immediate and intense. Critics argued that contamination must have affected the radiocarbon samples, while others simply ignored the evidence altogether. The resistance became so entrenched that researchers later coined the phrase Clovis primacy syndrome to describe what they considered an increasingly outdated and futile defense of the traditional model. Even decades later, surveys revealed that only about 38% of archaeologists fully accepted Adovazio's conclusions. Another 38% remained uncertain, and the remainder continued to reject the early dates. Meadowcroft had opened the first crack in the established narrative, but Paisley Caves widened that fracture into something impossible to overlook. As debate surrounding Paisley intensified, another remarkable site was quietly emerging approximately 70 miles away, near the small community of Riley in Oregon's Harney County. Since 2011, University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady had been excavating Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, where initial discoveries included obsidian flakes and groundstone tools resting near the shelter's edge. Unlike Paisley, Rimrock Draw was not yielding preserved DNA. Instead, it offered something equally valuable: a geological timeline preserved within layers of volcanic ash, animal remains, and stone artifacts. One distinctive layer of white ash proved especially significant after scientists identified it as material deposited during a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens approximately 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. This volcanic deposit served as a natural chronological marker. Any object discovered beneath the ash had to be older than the eruption itself, creating an extraordinarily reliable timeline written directly into the landscape. Excavating below this ancient ash layer, researchers encountered evidence that challenged conventional expectations once again. 27 tiny fragments of tooth enamel emerged from the soil, including remains belonging to yesterday's camel, an Ice Age species that once roamed North America, and Bison antiquus, the massive prehistoric ancestor of today's American buffalo. Both species had vanished thousands of years ago, yet their remains rested beneath the volcanic ash, preserved within geological layers that continued pushing the story of early human occupation further into the distant past. The discoveries at Rimrock Draw did not end with the Ice Age animal remains. As archaeologists continued carefully peeling back the ancient layers beneath the Mount St. Helens ash, another object slowly emerged from the sediment, and unlike the scattered enamel fragments, this one carried unmistakable signs of deliberate craftsmanship. Resting within the same prehistoric layer was a stone implement fashioned from orange chalcedony, a translucent, glass-like variety of agate, whose polished surface still reflected light, despite having remained buried for tens of thousands of years. It was not a simple cutting tool. Close examination revealed multiple working edges, each shaped for a different purpose. One side formed a gracefully curved cutting edge, another had been flattened into a scraping surface, while a third displayed fine saw-like teeth that had been worn smooth through repeated use. Dr. Patrick O'Grady would later compare the artifact to an ancient Swiss army knife because of its remarkable versatility. The microscopic wear patterns told an even more compelling story. The polished teeth were not the result of a few days or even a few months of work. They represented years of constant use, repeated sharpening, and countless repairs. This was not a disposable tool abandoned after a single hunt. It had belonged to someone who depended upon it every day, carrying it from camp to camp, maintaining it carefully until one day, for reasons now lost to history, it was laid down for the final time and never recovered. Yet the tool's craftsmanship was only part of its significance. Its position within the archaeological layers transformed it from an interesting artifact into a chronological puzzle with enormous implications. The implement rested approximately 10 centimeters beneath the camel tooth fragments, placing it deeper than the already ancient animal remains. Stratigraphy alone suggested the tool had to be older, but archaeologists knew that extraordinary claims demanded extraordinary evidence. The camel and bison antiquus teeth were therefore sent for laboratory analysis, and when the dating results arrived, the researchers could scarcely believe what they were seeing. Both independent tests converged on the same astonishing age, indicating that the animals had lived approximately 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. Dr. O'Grady later admitted that receiving even a single date that ancient was deeply unsettling, explaining that no responsible scientist wants to announce such a revolutionary finding without overwhelming evidence to support it. Fortunately, the laboratory had produced not one result, but two, generated from separate samples using independent analyses, and both pointed to precisely the same period. Sitting beneath remains already dated to more than 21 millennia ago, the chalcedony tool strongly suggested that a human presence at Rimrock Draw reached even further into the past. Reflecting on the moment, O'Grady recalled thinking, "Holy smoke, we've got 15,800 as a date for the ash. We have teeth fragments underneath that turn out to be camel. And below that we have a tool that, is probably over 18,000 deeper than the ash." It was the kind of realization that forces archaeologists to question everything they thought they understood about the peopling of North America. As specialists examined the artifact more closely, they recognized that it belonged to a technological tradition entirely different from the familiar Clovis culture. Rather than the distinctive fluted spear points long considered the hallmark of America's earliest inhabitants, this implement displayed the characteristics of what archaeologists call the Western stemmed tradition. Its elongated blade, weak shoulders, and rounded base reflected a completely different method of stoneworking, suggesting that its maker had learned techniques passed down through another cultural lineage altogether. These tools predated Clovis technology by thousands of years and appeared to represent an entirely separate tradition, perhaps one that originated in a different region or even arrived through a different migration. Whoever crafted this Chalcedony implement was almost certainly not Clovis. They belonged to another people whose story had largely vanished from history, leaving behind only scattered traces buried beneath volcanic ash and layers of ancient earth. With every new excavation, the once simple narrative of the first Americans grew increasingly complex, revealing a continent that may have witnessed multiple waves of human occupation long before the famous Clovis hunters ever appeared. Remarkably, however, Oregon was only the opening chapter of a much larger mystery. Nearly 700 miles to the south, across the stark landscapes of the American Southwest, another discovery was quietly waiting beneath an endless sea of white gypsum. In the vast dunes of what is now White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, a landscape shaped by the vanished waters of ancient Lake Otero, researchers stumbled upon evidence unlike anything they had encountered before. Beginning in 2009, scientists surveying the dried lake beds noticed faint impressions pressed into the hardened gypsum. As more sediment was carefully removed, those impressions resolved into unmistakable human footprints. Not a single isolated print, but 61 fossilized tracks stretching across what had once been the muddy shoreline of an Ice Age lake. The footprints were astonishingly well preserved. Individual toes remained clearly visible, delicate arches curved naturally through the sediment, and the varying sizes told the story of an entire group moving together across the ancient landscape. Some tracks belonged to small children, while others were left by adults striding quickly, perhaps even running. For a brief moment, more than 20,000 years ago, families had crossed the wet shoreline, leaving behind footprints that the sun dried, fresh layers of sediment buried, and time preserved with extraordinary precision until modern researchers uncovered them thousands of years later. Dating such extraordinary evidence required the same level of caution that had accompanied the discoveries in Oregon. In 2021, scientists performed radiocarbon dating on seeds of spiral ditch grass recovered from the same sedimentary layers as the footprints. The results indicated an age between 21,000 and 23,000 years, immediately igniting controversy because they pushed human occupation deep into the height of the last glacial maximum. Critics quickly argued that groundwater might have contaminated the seeds with ancient carbon, artificially inflating their age. Rather than dismissing these concerns, researchers responded by employing an entirely different dating approach. This time, they analyzed conifer pollen preserved within the same layers. Unlike the seeds, pollen cannot absorb old carbon from groundwater because it originates directly from living trees. When the pollen dates matched the seed dates almost perfectly, the evidence became considerably stronger. Then, in June 2025, another independent study published in Science Advances examined organic material preserved in wetland mud and shallow lake sediments surrounding the footprints. 3 separate dating methods involving seeds, pollen, and organic sediments all converged on the same remarkable conclusion. Human beings had walked across the shores of Lake Otero between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, during one of the coldest and most unforgiving periods of the last ice age. Even more astonishing, the human tracks intertwined with those of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous Ice Age animals whose footprints crossed the same muddy shoreline before all were sealed together beneath layers of sediment. For many archaeologists, the White Sands footprints already represented one of the most controversial discoveries of the century. Yet even these ancient tracks, dating back approximately 23,000 years at most, would soon seem almost recent compared with another astonishing discovery waiting far to the west. In Southern California, history was about to take an even more dramatic turn. There, during an ordinary freeway construction project, workers who had never intended to make an archaeological discovery would accidentally uncover evidence so astonishing that it would make the White Sands footprints appear almost modern by comparison. The discoveries at White Sands had already pushed the accepted timeline of human occupation in North America to its limits. Fossilized footprints preserved alongside the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths suggested that people had been walking across the shores of ancient Lake Otero more than 21,000 years ago, during the harshest period of the last ice age. For many archaeologists, that evidence alone was difficult enough to accept. Yet even those remarkable footprints would soon seem almost recent, compared with what was about to emerge hundreds of miles farther west. The next chapter in this story did not begin with a carefully planned archaeological expedition or an ambitious scientific research project. It began during an ordinary freeway construction job in Southern California. Heavy machinery was cutting through layers of earth when the blade suddenly struck something solid. The equipment ground to a halt, and the construction foreman walked over, expecting to find a buried boulder, an old utility pipe, or perhaps a forgotten section of concrete. Instead, protruding from the soil was the unmistakable curve of ancient bone. Within moments, construction stopped entirely, and paleontologists were called to investigate what initially appeared to be nothing more than another Ice Age fossil. As excavation continued, they uncovered the partial remains of a mastodon, the elephant-like giant that once roamed North America before disappearing near the close of the Ice Age. At first glance, it seemed like an exciting but routine paleontological discovery. Then the team looked closer, and everything changed. The bones were not resting naturally in the sediment as though the animal had simply died where it fell. Instead, they appeared to preserve the frozen aftermath of an event that had unfolded more than 100,000 years earlier. The site was no longer just a fossil deposit. It had become what investigators increasingly recognized as a prehistoric scene, one apparently shaped by intelligent hands. As the sediment was carefully removed from around the skeleton, the evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The mastodon bones displayed distinctive spiral fractures, a type of breakage that forms only when fresh bone is deliberately struck, while it still contains moisture and collagen. Ancient fossilized bone does not fracture in this way. Dry bone splinters into irregular fragments, whereas fresh bone twists and peels apart in characteristic spirals. To specialists familiar with prehistoric butchering sites, these fractures suggested purposeful breakage rather than natural damage. The most likely explanation was that someone had intentionally smashed the bones to reach the rich marrow hidden inside, an exceptionally nutritious food source prized by prehistoric hunter-gatherers around the world. Nearby, scattered among the skeletal remains, researchers discovered 5 large, rounded cobbles, unlike any stones naturally occurring within the surrounding sediments. Geological analysis showed they were far too large to have been transported there by flowing water. They had been deliberately carried to the site by someone who intended to use them. Their battered surfaces strongly resembled hammerstones and anvils, precisely the kinds of tools capable of producing the spiral fractures visible on the mastodon bones. After completing whatever task had brought them there, those unknown individuals had simply walked away, leaving behind both the broken bones and the heavy stones that had served as their tools. The implications were extraordinary, but they became truly astonishing only after scientists attempted to determine the site's age. Using uranium-thorium radiometric analysis, researchers repeatedly dated the mastodon remains. Every independent test returned essentially the same result. The bones were approximately 130,700 years old. It was a number so unexpected that many scientists initially struggled to accept it. In 2017, the findings were formally published in the journal Nature by Stephen Holin, Kathleen Holin, Thomas Demarais, and Richard Fullagar. Written with exceptional caution, the paper proposed that some unidentified human relative had been present in North America more than 130,000 years ago. Not modern Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals. Potentially another human species altogether, one for which existing migration models offered no satisfactory explanation. Unsurprisingly, the Ceruti Mastodon site immediately became one of the most controversial discoveries in modern archaeology. Many researchers remained deeply skeptical, arguing that natural processes could potentially explain the damaged bones, while others avoided engaging with the evidence entirely because accepting such an early date would overturn nearly every established model of human migration into the Americas. To this day, the identity of whoever or whatever broke those mastodon bones remains one of archaeology's greatest unanswered mysteries. As researchers wrestled with the implications of Ceruti, another line of evidence was quietly reshaping ideas about how the first Americans may have reached the continent in the first place. For generations, the accepted explanation centered almost exclusively on Beringia, the vast land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska during periods of low sea level. According to the traditional model, every early population entered North America through this single northern gateway before dispersing southward. Increasingly, however, discoveries from archaeology, genetics, and ancient seafaring studies have suggested that the story may have been far more complex. Some researchers now argue that at least part of the earliest migration may have occurred not across frozen land, but along coastlines by sea. At first glance, such an idea appears improbable. Yet evidence from another part of the world demonstrates that ancient humans were capable of crossing open water far earlier than once believed. On the Mediterranean island of Crete, which has remained isolated from the mainland for roughly 5 million years, archaeologists led by Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou uncovered stone tools at 2 separate sites dating between approximately 130,000 and 700,000 years ago. Because Crete has never been connected to continental Europe during the existence of humans, anyone who reached the island must have crossed at least 40 miles of open sea in intentionally constructed watercraft. The tools themselves resembled technologies associated with Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, early human ancestors who lived long before modern humans appeared. If these ancient populations possessed the knowledge necessary to build seaworthy boats and navigate across open water, then the long-standing assumption that early humans lacked meaningful maritime capabilities could no longer be maintained. As one member of the research team observed, if ancient humans could successfully navigate the Mediterranean before 130,000 years ago, then crossing other stretches of water elsewhere in the world becomes considerably more plausible. The discovery forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions that had shaped migration theories for decades.